The fall of Rome's shadow. The story begins not with silence, but with an echo, the echo of Rome's fall. Imagine the year 476 CE, when the teenage emperor Romulus Augustulus was deposed by the Germanic general Odoacer, a moment often dramatized as the end of the ancient world. But in truth, no single day saw the lights go out. The shadow of Rome lingered across Europe for centuries, its aqueducts still carrying water, its roads still binding far-flung towns, its laws still whispered in courts. Yet as that shadow stretched longer, people living beneath it sensed the world they had known was slipping away. To the people of the time, it may not have seemed like a collapse. Farmers still ploughed their fields, merchants still traded, churches still rang bells on Sunday mornings. But cracks spread in the foundations of empire. Trade routes became fragile, coinage debased, and the security once guaranteed by Rome's legions faded into uncertainty. Cities that had thrived under the Pax Romana began to shrink. Great forums where citizens had gathered turned into pasture land, where goats grazed among marble columns. One striking image survives from the Italian city of Aquileia, once a bustling hub of commerce, its amphitheatre filled with thousands of cheering voices. By the 6th century, its streets lay deserted. In Britain, once dotted with thriving Roman villas, mosaics were left to crumble as Anglo-Saxon newcomers took root. Across Gaul, aqueducts fell into disrepair. Weeds sprouted in Roman baths. Slowly, brick by brick, the material grandeur of empire dissolved into ruin. And yet, even in ruins, Rome's shadow did not vanish. Scholars debate whether people in the 5th century felt they were living in a new world or merely a poorer version of the old one. Some even argue the very idea of a fall was invented later by historians eager for drama. Was it a sudden collapse, or a long twilight, in which the sun of empire dimmed but never quite set? In this twilight, myths began to grow. One fringe tale tells of the last legion, Roman soldiers who supposedly fled west and became the ancestors of the knights of medieval Europe. Though historians dismiss this as legend, it reflects a deeper truth. People clung to memories of Rome as a golden age, even as they adapted to a harsher reality. Rome's shadow shaped everything that followed. The kings who rose in its ruins, the monks who copied its books, the builders who scavenged its stones to raise new churches. And as the centuries passed, what was lost became harder to measure. For in this shadow, history itself began to blur, leaving behind only fragments. A name born of prejudice. The phrase Dark Ages rolls easily off the tongue, yet it was never a label used by the people who actually lived through those centuries. It was a later invention, a judgment, not a description. To call an entire age dark is to declare it barren, ignorant, and hopeless. But who first lit that torch of disdain, and why has it burned so brightly in our historical imagination? The term traces back to the Italian scholar Petrarch in the 14th century. Standing amid the ruins of Rome, Petrarch longed for a return to classical greatness, and he saw his own era as one of decline. In his letters, he wrote of the darkness of ignorance that had supposedly settled over Europe after Rome's fall. Petrarch, of course, was not describing facts on the ground. He was casting judgment through the eyes of a man dazzled by the glory of antiquity. What followed was a centuries-long habit. Renaissance thinkers painted themselves as torchbearers of enlightenment, and in order to shine brighter, they cast the Middle Ages into shadow. Later, Enlightenment philosophers took up this rhetoric. Voltaire, Diderot, and Gibbon found in the so-called Dark Ages a convenient foil for their own reason and progress. Edward Gibbon's monumental decline and fall of the Roman Empire made the phrase dark synonymous with superstition, priestcraft, and barbarism. The medieval centuries were caricatured as a time when science died, faith smothered inquiry, and only ignorance reigned. But was that really the case? Scholars today debate whether the label has distorted more than it clarified. Modern archaeology, for instance, has revealed flourishing networks of trade in the early Middle Ages, links stretching from Scandinavia to Byzantium. Manuscripts copied by monks preserved Aristotle, Galen, and Cicero. Cathedrals soared with architectural brilliance that even Rome never attempted, and to call such centuries dark is, in many ways, to miss their hidden light. And yet, prejudice lingers. Even in schoolrooms today, maps sometimes show a neat break. Ancient Rome ending abruptly, Dark Ages beginning in murky tones, and Renaissance gleaming with colour. But life never divided itself so cleanly. A peasant sowing oats in 600 CE did not consider himself lost in darkness. He was simply living, praying, working, and surviving in his own world. One quirky story illustrates this bias well. In the 18th century, a French historian claimed that medieval people never bathed and thus lived in filth and ignorance. Modern evidence reveals the opposite. Public bathhouses were common, scented soaps were made, and hygiene was far from forgotten. But the myth of the dirty, backward medieval peasant was too powerful a symbol for Enlightenment polemicists to abandon. So we must ask, is the Dark Ages a real epoch, or is it an invention born of comparison, dark only when set beside the dazzling brilliance of Rome and the Renaissance? Scholars still debate whether it makes sense to preserve the term at all, or whether it should be retired in favour of phrases like early Middle Ages. Yet the prejudice remains deeply rooted, and it continues to shape the way the story of Europe is told. To call an era dark is to suggest that someone, somewhere, must later bring the dawn. But perhaps what we see as darkness was, for those who lived it, a different kind of light, softer, flickering, but not extinguished. The vanishing cities. Walk through the ruins of a Roman forum today, and you may feel a pang of loss, the sense that something vast once thrived here. For the people who inherited these spaces in the 5th and 6th centuries, that feeling was not nostalgia but daily reality. Cities, the engines of the Roman world, slowly emptied out. What had once been the heart of empire became a scattering of hollow shells. The lights of urban life dimmed, one by one. Take Londinium, Roman London, as an example. In the 3rd century, it had been a bustling provincial capital, its streets laid with stone, its wharves crowded with merchants unloading goods from the far corners of the empire. By the 7th century, much of it was abandoned. Wooden huts sprouted amid broken walls. Cattle grazed in what had been a governor's residence. For centuries, London nearly ceased to exist. Only later would it be reborn, but for a time the city was less a capital than a ghost. It was not only Britain. Across Gaul, towns shrank. In Italy, even Rome itself suffered. Once a metropolis of over 1 million souls, it dwindled to perhaps 20,000 by the early Middle Ages. Grass grew in the cracks of the Colosseum. Once grand bathhouses were scavenged for brick and marble. To travellers from Constantinople or Baghdad, Western cities must have looked like the corpses of a fallen civilization. Yet the story is more complicated than simple collapse. Some places adapted rather than vanished. Ravenna became a glittering capital under the Ostrogoths and later the Byzantines, famous for its shimmering mosaics. In Gaul, Paris held on, transformed from a Roman outpost to a Frankish stronghold. Cities did not disappear so much as mutate, shrinking into fortified settlements where life pulsed differently, slower, more localized. Archaeology adds depth to this picture. Excavations in Cologne show workshops continuing into the early Middle Ages, producing glass and metal goods. In York, Roman walls were patched and reused by Anglo-Saxon settlers. Urban decline was real, but it was uneven, a patchwork of survival and ruin. Scholars still debate whether we should speak of vanishing cities at all, or of transformation into something new. Legends sprouted in these ruins. In deserted amphitheatres, people whispered that giants had once walked the earth. Abandoned aqueducts became homes for owls, their echoing tunnels inspiring tales of underground spirits. One quirky account from the 8th century tells of villagers believing that the Colosseum had been a temple of demons, and they crossed themselves when passing its shadow. And yet, these ruins served a purpose. Broken marble was carted away to build new churches. Old stones were given new lives as walls for monasteries. The past was not entirely abandoned, it was recycled, reshaped, absorbed into a world that no longer resembled Rome. So when we speak of the vanishing cities, perhaps we should think less of disappearance and more of metamorphosis. The humming metropolis became the hushed fortress. The cosmopolitan plaza became the parish square. Light did not go out entirely, it simply glowed in different rooms. Monks, manuscripts, and memory. Amid the ruins of cities and the silence of broken aqueducts, one quiet force laboured to preserve fragments of the old world, the monks. Clad in coarse wool robes, their days structured by bells and prayers, they were not warriors, nor kings, nor merchants. Yet their patient work with quill and parchment ensured that voices from antiquity whispered into the future. In Ireland, cut off from the turmoil of continental Europe, monasteries became unlikely islands of learning. On windswept coasts, monks such as those at Clonmacnoise and Skellig Michael bent over wooden desks, copying texts by candlelight. Latin poetry, Roman law, fragments of Aristotle, all painstakingly written in careful script. Some monks illuminated their manuscripts with fantastical designs, spirals, animals, interlaced patterns that seemed to glow with otherworldly intensity. The Book of Kells, produced around 800 CE, is perhaps the most famous of these. Its page is alive with colour even after more than a millennium. Elsewhere, in Italy and Gaul, Benedictine monasteries spread like lanterns across a darkened map. Saint Benedict himself, living in the 6th century, had never intended to found an empire of learning. His rule prescribed humility, obedience, and prayer. Yet, in the rhythm of ora et labora, pray and work, the copying of manuscripts became work of the highest order. To write was to serve God, and in serving, they saved the wisdom of ages. The survival of texts was fragile. A single manuscript might take a year to copy, requiring dozens of animal skins for parchment. Fires, floods, or neglect could erase centuries of thought in an instant. Scholars still debate whether whole works of antiquity vanished simply because no monk chose to copy them. How much philosophy, poetry, or science was lost forever because it did not seem useful or pious at the time. There are strange tales too. A 9th century monk is said to have copied an entire manuscript in one night after making a deal with the devil. When he could not finish, he supposedly drew a full-page portrait of Satan himself, the famous Devil's Bible that still survives today in Prague. While likely more legend than fact, the story captures the sense of awe surrounding these books, as if they were treasures from another world. Monks were not only preservers, but also transformers. They glossed pagan texts with Christian commentary, reframing Aristotle as a guide to theology, or Ovid as a moral lesson. Knowledge was not transmitted unchanged, it was filtered through the pens of men who saw themselves as servants of faith. Some modern historians argue this reshaping was itself a kind of cover-up, a selective remembering that concealed as much as it preserved. And yet, without them, so much would have perished. The ideas of Cicero, the geometry of Euclid, the medical texts of Galen all came to us because monks in cold stone chambers chose to copy one more page before the candle sputtered out. In this way, the memory of the ancient world was not entirely extinguished. It flickered like a small flame, sheltered from the wind by men who may not have known they were keeping civilization itself alive. The Lost Kingdoms. In the wake of Rome's retreat, a new political landscape emerged. Instead of a single empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, Europe became a patchwork quilt of kingdoms, some fleeting, some enduring, all reshaping the continent's destiny. Historians once called them barbarian kingdoms, echoing Roman contempt, but for the people who lived in them, these were the new centres of power, the places where law, identity and memory were remade. The Visigoths carved out their realm in Spain. Once raiders who had sacked Rome in 410 CE, they settled into Iberia and fashioned a monarchy that lasted nearly 3 centuries. Their capital at Toledo became a hub where Roman law mingled with Gothic custom. Bishops wielded enormous influence, crafting councils that governed both church and state. Even as their kings changed hands through coups and assassinations, the Visigothic kingdom laid the groundwork for Spain's later Catholic identity. North of them, the Franks rose under the Merovingians. Clovis, the Frankish king, who converted to Christianity around 500 CE, fused tribal authority with Roman tradition, his baptism setting the stage for France's self-image as the eldest daughter of the Church. His dynasty, the long-haired Merovingians, became figures of both legend and scandal, praised for uniting Gaul, mocked for degeneracy. Later chroniclers accused them of doing little more than lounging in their palaces, while ambitious mayors of the palace pulled the strings. In Italy, the Ostrogoths under Theodoric ruled from Ravenna, blending Roman administration with Gothic leadership. Theodoric styled himself a protector of Rome's legacy, restoring monuments, commissioning art, and maintaining the Senate. His reign offered a brief glimpse of what a post-Roman synthesis might look like, a Germanic king upholding Roman law, while tolerating both Catholic and Arians. Yet his dream unravelled after his death, and Italy became a battleground once more. And in Britain, cut off from the empire's core, new kingdoms sprouted like shoots from old stumps. Anglo-Saxon realms, Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, took shape in former Roman provinces. Their kings traced lineages back to mythical founders, blending pagan law with new Christian faith. One king, Edwin of Northumbria, was said to have been converted after a dream of a mysterious figure promising victory if he embraced the cross. Whether fact or fiction, such stories reveal the symbolic weight of kingship in a fractured world. Some kingdoms, though powerful in their time, have almost slipped through the cracks of memory. The Burgundians in southeastern Gaul, for instance, or the Lombards who later ruled Italy, are often overshadowed by the Franks and Goths. Yet each left marks in law codes, place names, and cultural traditions. Archaeologists uncover their traces in cemeteries, brooches, swords, and jewellery, buried with the dead, silent testaments to peoples who lived in the shadow of fading Rome. One curious tidbit: the Vandals, often blamed for savagery, ruled a surprisingly sophisticated kingdom in North Africa. From Carthage, they commanded fleets and negotiated treaties with Byzantium. The modern word vandalism comes from propaganda centuries later, when church writers demonized them as heretics and destroyers. Scholars still debate whether the Vandals deserve their fearsome reputation or whether they were victims of history's smear campaign. In these kingdoms, the memory of Rome lingered, but in fragments. Law codes copied Roman statutes, kings wore Roman-style crowns, cities bore Roman names. Yet new traditions grew atop the ruins, songs, myths, and dynasties that gave identity to tribes once considered outsiders. If Rome had been a single mighty tree, these were the saplings rising from its fallen trunk, each bending toward its own light. They were the lost kingdoms, lost not because they vanished without a trace, but because history later obscured their stories beneath the brighter banners of empire and Renaissance. Yet in their courts and churches, the medieval world was already being born: plagues, famines, and fears. If political kingdoms gave shape to the post-Roman world, it was disease and disaster that often defined its rhythm. For every coronation, there were silent years of hunger. For every new monastery, there were villages emptied by plague. These centuries were not simply dark in the sense of lost knowledge. They were darkened by the daily struggle to survive against forces neither king nor priest could fully command. The Justinianic plague is perhaps the most chilling example. Beginning around 541 CE, it swept through the Mediterranean, carried by rats and fleas along the trade routes that still connected east and west. Constantinople, the Byzantine capital, was struck with terrifying ferocity. Procopius, a historian of the time, described corpses stacked in the streets, barges overflowing with the dead pushed out to sea. Estimates vary, but some scholars suggest that as much as half the population of the empire perished. For a city already reeling from wars and fires, it was a wound that never quite healed. Western Europe was not spared. The plague ebbed and returned in waves, each outbreak hollowing villages and leaving fields untilled. In Gaul, chroniclers spoke of people burying entire families in single graves. One monk wrote that the world seemed empty. Whether those words were exaggeration or not, they capture the psychological terror of a society that felt nature itself had turned against them. Nor was plague the only scourge. Famines stalked the land, often triggered by climate shifts. Around the late 6th and early 7th centuries, evidence suggests a period of unusual cooling, the so-called late antique Little Ice Age. Crops failed, harvests diminished, and hunger spread. In Ireland, annals speak of years when a failure of bread left countless dead. In other places, desperate people resorted to eating bark, grass, even leaves. There, these hardships shaped belief. When disaster struck, people often interpreted it through the lens of faith. A famine might be seen as divine punishment for sin, a plague as the work of demons. Priests led processions, carrying relics through the fields in hopes of divine mercy. Saints' cults flourished. Shrines to miraculous healers drew desperate pilgrims. Fear deepened devotion, but it also bred suspicion of witches, of outsiders, of those accused of angering God. One strange legend tells of a village in the Alps where the people, convinced a demon lived in the mountains and brought famine, staged a midnight ritual to chase it away with firebrands and horns. Whether real or folkloric, it reveals how communities sought to explain forces they could not control. And yet, amid catastrophe, resilience appeared. Archaeology shows abandoned fields slowly repopulated, settlements rebuilt, grain storage pits dug deeper and lined with clay to preserve harvests. Communities adapted, even if at great cost. Scholars still debate whether these disasters truly defined the Dark Ages, or whether later chroniclers, eager to emphasize suffering, exaggerated their reach. But there can be little doubt that fear of plague, of famine, of sudden death was woven into the fabric of life. It made people cling more tightly to faith, to ritual, to whatever order kings and priests could offer. In this way, disaster shaped culture as surely as conquest did. In the silence of the graveyards and the hunger of the fields, medieval Europe was learning hard lessons, that survival required endurance, and that endurance often depended on stories of saints, of miracles, of divine justice, that gave meaning to suffering when explanations were few. Secrets beneath the soil. If chronicles were sparse and memories selective, the earth itself became the truest historian of the so-called Dark Ages. Beneath fields and forests, beneath the streets of modern cities, lie the fragments of lives once lived, pottery shards, burial goods, coins, seeds, broken tools, bones. Archaeology, more than parchment, has given us the ability to listen to voices that never wrote a word. Consider Sutton Hoo, discovered in 1939 in the quiet soil of Suffolk, England. There, An Anglo-Saxon ship burial revealed treasures of astonishing craftsmanship, a helmet patterned with beasts, gold buckles, silverware from Byzantium. The burial, dating from the early 7th century, shattered the old image of a dark and crude age. Here was proof of a society with wealth, artistry, and far-reaching connections. The man buried, likely a king, was interred not in obscurity but with splendour to rival the pharaohs. Elsewhere, archaeologists uncover signs of bustling trade where written sources claim only decline. At Ribe in Denmark, layers of soil show evidence of bead-making workshops and imported goods from the Middle East. In France, excavations reveal pottery styles blending Roman, Frankish, and Visigothic influences, proof of cultural exchange. Coins stamped with Arabic inscriptions have been found in Scandinavia, carried north by traders long before Viking became a household word. These objects, silent yet eloquent, tell of worlds more connected than old historians allowed. Sometimes the soil speaks of catastrophe. Pollen analysis from lake beds reveals sudden drops in grain cultivation around the mid-6th century, likely tied to the volcanic eruptions and climate cooling that deepened famine. Mass graves, their skeletons showing signs of plague, remind us of the Justinianic catastrophe. Even the smallest clues, rat bones preserved in middens, help map the spread of disease across continents. And then there are the mysteries. In a field in Germany, archaeologists uncovered a circular trench with carefully placed bones and artifacts dating from the early medieval period. Was it a ritual site? A memorial? Scholars still debate. In Scotland, a series of carved stones depicting fantastical beasts continue to puzzle researchers. Were they heraldic emblems, pagan symbols, or Christian reinterpretations? One curious discovery emerged in 2014 near Cambridge. The skeleton of a woman buried face down, her ankles tied. Was she a criminal, a witch, or merely a victim of fear? The grave refuses to explain, but it hints at anxieties and rituals lost to memory. Archaeology has also corrected centuries of bias. Written chronicles often focus on kings, battles, and bishops, ignoring the lives of ordinary people. But the soil preserves their world. Post holes of wooden huts reveal villages where peasants lived. Charred grains in hearths speak of what was eaten. Loom weights and spindle whirls testify to the quiet industry of women weaving cloth. From these fragments, we reconstruct a world in which daily life carried on despite wars and famines. Still, scholars debate how far we can stretch these clues. Does a golden buckle in a grave prove the wealth of a society, or only the wealth of one elite family? Does a decline in pollen always mean famine, or could it mean land turned to pasture instead? Archaeology can answer questions, but it also raises them, offering tantalizing glimpses while keeping secrets close. Yet there is wonder in this uncertainty. The soil has given us proof that the so-called Dark Ages were not wholly dark. The treasures of Sutton Hoo, the workshops of Ribe, the mosaics unearthed in Ravenna, all are flickers of light long buried, now revealed. The ground remembers what chronicles forgot, and in that memory lies a truth. History is never fully lost, it only waits patient beneath our feet. The hidden power of women. When we think of the early medieval world, we often imagine kings, warriors and monks, yet women, often absent from the chronicles, wielded influence in ways both visible and subtle. From queens shaping policy to abbesses directing communities, the so-called Dark Ages were not a time of female invisibility. They were a time of quiet power operating in parallel to the male-dominated narratives of war and conquest. Consider the example of Queen Brunhilde of Austrasia, ruling in the late 6th century. A Visigoth by birth, she married into Frankish royalty and became one of the most politically shrewd rulers of her era. Acting as regent for her sons and grandsons, she navigated a maze of rival factions, orchestrated alliances, and even commanded armies in certain campaigns. Chroniclers from her time, often hostile male clerics, tried to frame her as manipulative or cruel, but recent analysis suggests a ruler exercising remarkable agency in an unstable world. Abbesses, too, held significant authority. At the Abbey of Chelles in northern France, women oversaw lands, administered justice, and directed the copying of manuscripts. They commanded respect from bishops and kings alike. Some abbesses were patrons of scholarship, commissioning illuminated texts that would survive centuries. In Ireland, the legendary Abbess St. Brigid combined spiritual leadership with practical management of vast monastic estates, effectively running entire communities that included farmers, craftsmen, and scholars. The lives of ordinary women also carried weight, though often invisible in official records. In rural villages, women managed households, prepared food, spun cloth, and tended livestock. They preserved knowledge of herbal remedies, midwifery, and local customs. Some archaeological finds, like grave goods in Anglo-Saxon cemeteries, show women buried with tools of trade or symbols of status, suggesting roles beyond the purely domestic. Scholars still debate whether these artifacts reflect true autonomy or symbolic representation, but their presence hints at a nuanced reality. Quirky stories survive, often filtered through folklore. One 9th century tale recounts a woman who disguised herself as a monk to protect her abbey from Viking raiders. Another describes a noblewoman who, after being widowed, led her household in defence of a small fort, using both strategy and sheer determination to repel attackers. Whether entirely factual or embellished, such stories underscore the breadth of female influence, often hidden behind conventional histories. Pagan traditions, too, may have amplified women's roles in ways forgotten by Christian chroniclers. Priestesses, seers, and local wise women appear in folk memory as counsellors, mediators, and arbiters. When Christian writers dismissed them as witches or charlatans, they effectively erased a complex network of female authority from the historical record. Ultimately, women shaped politics, religion, and culture across the early medieval world. Their power was often exercised in corridors of monasteries, behind palace walls, or within village communities, quiet, enduring, and transformative. Without them, the continuity of knowledge, faith, and local governance might have faltered entirely. Remember that monasteries copying Aristotle, or manuscripts lying buried beneath the soil, often depended on networks maintained by women. Their labour and influence formed a backbone supporting a civilization struggling to rise from the ashes of Rome. In other words, when we think we are seeing history's shadows, we are often seeing women's invisible hand guiding events, subtly yet decisively shaping the story of the Dark Ages. The pagan persistence. Even as Christianity spread across Europe, the old gods did not vanish quietly. Their shadows lingered in rituals, customs, and folklore, seeping into festivals, agricultural cycles, and the popular imagination. The conversion of Europe was a complex, uneven process, not a clean replacement of one belief system with another. Pagan practices persisted, sometimes openly, often subtly, influencing a world historians later painted as entirely Christian. In Scandinavia, for instance, Norse mythology thrived well into the Viking Age. Temples to Odin, Thor, and Freyja existed alongside new Christian churches. Rituals tied to seasonal cycles, sacrifices at solstices, sacred feasts, and offerings of livestock continued even as kings converted to Christianity for political advantage. The archaeological record supports this duality. Burials in Denmark and Sweden from the 9th century sometimes include both Christian symbols and pagan grave goods, swords, jewellery, and miniature boats intended to accompany the dead to the afterlife. Scholars still debate whether this reflects syncretism, mere superstition, or political strategy. In the British Isles, elements of pagan practice were woven into Christian celebrations. Festivals such as Samhain, later transformed into All Saints' Day or Halloween, retained echoes of earlier beliefs about spirits and the thinning of the veil between worlds. Trees, wells and springs, long considered sacred, were incorporated into Christian devotion, with saints taking on the protective roles once assigned to local deities. In Ireland, Saint Bridget herself may be a Christianized version of a pre-existing goddess, a deliberate merging that made conversion more palatable to the population. Some communities resisted change entirely. Isolated regions of Germany and the Baltic held onto pagan cults, occasionally clashing violently with Metamorphosis. Chronicles tell of missionaries being attacked, churches burned, and converts fleeing. These pockets of resistance demonstrate that the so-called Dark Ages were not only a time of Christian consolidation, but also of ongoing cultural negotiation, where old and new beliefs coexisted in tension. One quirky example comes from Iceland, where a 12th century law text, the Gragas, records a dispute over the use of pagan rituals alongside Christian courts. Villagers debated whether invoking old gods to ensure justice was acceptable. Though eventually subordinated to Christian authority, the record suggests that even centuries after nominal conversion, pagan memory retained a functional role in society. Even in art and literature, pagan motifs survived. Manuscripts often include marginal illustrations of fantastical beasts, dragons, and hybrid creatures reminiscent of mythic traditions. Runic inscriptions coexist with Latin texts, suggesting literacy and religious practice were not always mutually exclusive. Yet, despite the persistence of old beliefs, Christian authorities often portrayed paganism as a moral failing, a darkness to be purged. Scholars debate whether the decline of paganism was gradual cultural evolution, coercion, or a combination of both. What is clear is that pagan traditions left a mark on European culture, rituals, symbols, and stories that would survive for centuries, shaping folklore, festivals, and even early literature. The pagan persistence reminds us that history is rarely a clean sweep. Even in the apparent dominance of one religion, the undercurrents of the past continue to ripple. Just as the monks preserved knowledge and women wielded quiet power, the old gods lingered, invisible but influential, reminding the living that the past never fully disappears, it merely adapts, waiting to resurface in unexpected forms. The fabric of faith. By the early Middle Ages, Christianity had not only survived Rome's collapse, but had woven itself into nearly every aspect of daily life. Churches, monasteries, and cathedrals became more than places of worship. They were centres of learning, law, and social organisation. Faith, in this period, was both deeply personal and a tool for structuring society. Yet the rise of Christian institutions was not purely spiritual. It was a deliberate weaving of authority, symbolism, and spectacle that shaped perceptions and reinforced hierarchies. Consider the Cathedral of Aachen, commissioned by Charlemagne in the late 8th century. Its soaring arches, mosaics, and relics were designed to awe both commoners and nobles alike. Relics, especially, carried enormous weight. Pieces of saints' bones, fragments of the true cross, or even clothing worn by revered figures were venerated across Europe. Pilgrims travelled great distances to see them, believing in their miraculous power. Churches used these relics to consolidate spiritual authority, attract donations, and assert dominance over rival centres. Scholars still debate whether the veneration of relics represented genuine piety or a strategic manipulation of belief. The liturgy itself shaped social consciousness. Daily prayers, the rhythm of the canonical hours, and seasonal festivals created a framework for life. Even labour and leisure were subordinated to the ecclesiastical calendar. In rural villages, planting, harvesting, and feasting were tied to religious observances. The church, in effect, became the clock by which society measured its time. Yet faith was not monolithic. The boundaries between orthodox practice and local custom blurred. In Brittany, pagan customs survived in the form of sacred wells and seasonal festivals, often absorbed into Christian celebration. In the Holy Roman Empire, local saints, cults reflected regional identities as much as religious devotion. One quirky case comes from 11th century France, where villagers reportedly carried a miraculous statue of a saint to a nearby river to ensure a good fish harvest, a practice combining folk tradition with formal faith. Education was intertwined with belief. Monastic schools taught reading, writing, and arithmetic, largely to enable proper scriptural study. Manuscripts were meticulously copied, not just to preserve classical knowledge, but to reinforce theological orthodoxy. In this sense, faith became both a spiritual and an intellectual fabric, threading through all levels of society. Scholars debate how much this framework stifled independent thought versus how much it enabled the survival of knowledge through turbulent centuries. Power, too, was woven through faith. Kings sought the church's blessing to legitimize rule, bishops mediated disputes, monasteries controlled vast tracts of land. In Ireland, abbesses could wield influence rivaling that of secular lords. In Francia, royal councils often convened in cathedrals. Faith, therefore, was both a moral compass and a political instrument, a fabric binding together disparate communities into a coherent, if hierarchical, society. Yet the Church was not immune to controversy. Iconoclasm, heresy trials, and debates over orthodoxy show that belief was contested and dynamic. Even in an era supposedly dominated by a single religion, the boundaries of faith were negotiated, challenged, and redefined. And, as with many elements of the so-called Dark Ages, what survives in texts and artifacts is only a fragmentary glimpse of the true complexity of belief. Through architecture, ritual, relics, and education, the fabric of faith bound early medieval Europe together, creating a structure of meaning amid the uncertainties of a world recovering from empire. It provided comfort, guidance, and authority, while simultaneously shaping the intellectual, cultural, and political landscape for centuries to come. Lost science, hidden sparks. The so-called Dark Ages were not devoid of curiosity or invention. While some historians once described this period as a scientific void, closer examination reveals sparks of innovation quietly glowing beneath the surface. Knowledge survived, adapted, and sometimes even advanced, despite the political turmoil and societal upheaval that followed Rome's collapse. Take the field of agriculture. The heavy plough, emerging around the 6th century in northern Europe, transformed farming in ways few contemporaries fully understood. Unlike the lighter Roman plough, it could turn dense clay soils, enabling cultivation of previously unproductive lands. This seemingly simple tool reshaped economies, allowing settlements to expand, population to grow, and trade to flourish. Similarly, watermills and windmills proliferated, harnessing energy in ways that medieval engineers sometimes described with delight and awe. Scholars debate whether such innovations arose independently or were adaptations of Roman technologies, but their impact was undeniable. Medicine also persisted, often blending empirical observation with spiritual practice. Monks in places like the Abbey of Monte Cassino copied texts by Galen and Hippocrates, preserving a tradition of rational inquiry alongside prayers for healing. Herbal remedies, documented in manuscripts and passed orally in villages, often proved effective. One quirky example comes from the 10th century. A physician recommending a poultice made from crushed vipers to treat gangrene. While it sounds bizarre today, Chemical analysis shows some venom components can stimulate tissue repair. Scholars still debate how much early medieval medicine relied on trial and error versus inherited wisdom. Mathematics and astronomy continued as well. Irish monks developed sophisticated systems for calculating Easter, requiring an understanding of lunar cycles and solar years. Monastic scholars in the Islamic world, meanwhile, preserved and expanded upon Greek and Indian mathematical knowledge, which would later re-enter Europe through translations. Even in the West, cathedral schools fostered the study of the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, ensuring that some intellectual rigour survived the centuries often labelled dark. Engineering, too, saw quiet progress. Bridges, aqueduct repairs, and fortifications demonstrate practical ingenuity. One unusual find is a 9th century drawbridge mechanism in France, featuring counterweights and pulleys sophisticated enough to rival later medieval designs. These inventions suggest that creativity thrived under constraints, often motivated by necessity rather than curiosity alone. Even literacy itself was an innovation, in a sense. Scripts evolved. Carolingian minuscule, developed under Charlemagne's reforms, standardized writing across Europe. This made texts easier to read and copy, indirectly preserving classical works and aiding administrative efficiency. Scholars debate how revolutionary this change was, but it unquestionably influenced the survival of knowledge into the later Middle Ages and Renaissance. Fringe historians sometimes claim that advanced technologies, compasses, surgical tools, or mechanical clocks were suppressed by the Church. While largely speculative, these theories underscore the tension between innovation and authority. At the very least, the record shows selective transmission. Some ideas were nurtured, some lost, and some deliberately altered to align with prevailing religious or cultural norms. Thus, the Dark Ages were not entirely dark. Sparks of science flickered in monasteries, workshops, and farmlands. Knowledge was preserved, adapted, and in some cases, quietly advanced. It was a period of continuity, disguised as interruption, a hidden intellectual engine driving Europe toward eventual revival. The truth is clear. The story of lost science is not one of absence, but of subtle persistence, waiting for centuries to illuminate the world again. The Shrouded Wars. If the political map of early medieval Europe was a mosaic of emerging kingdoms, it was also a landscape defined by conflict. Yet many of these wars are obscured, either deliberately erased or poorly recorded, leaving us with glimpses rather than full narratives. Unlike the grand campaigns of Rome, the battles of the early Middle Ages were local, fragmented, and often chaotic, yet their consequences shaped nations, borders, and culture in ways still felt today. Consider the Frankish civil wars of the 6th century. After the death of Clovis I, the Merovingian kingdom splintered among his heirs. Sibling rivalries and noble factions triggered decades of localized warfare. Chronicles mention sieges, assassinations, and massacres, yet details are often vague or contradictory. Archaeology sometimes fills the gaps. Mass graves in northern France hint at sudden violence, while burned settlements confirm scorched earth campaigns. Scholars still debate whether these conflicts were primarily political, dynastic, or influenced by cultural tensions between Romanized elites and Frankish newcomers. In Britain, the Anglo-Saxon expansion brought waves of warfare against native Britons. Sites such as the Battle of Mons Badonicus remain legendary yet elusive. Some sources claim Arthur led the defence of British strongholds, but historians cannot verify his existence. Fringe theories suggest these battles were exaggerated or invented to create heroic lineage for later kings, demonstrating how memory and myth intertwine. Elsewhere, Viking raids left indelible marks. Beginning in the late 8th century, seafaring bands attacked monasteries, towns, and trade hubs. Lindisfarne in 793 CE became infamous, a stark symbol of vulnerability. Yet Vikings were not only raiders, they traded, settled, and integrated into local societies, leaving a complex legacy. Archaeology in Dublin and York reveals fortifications, docks, and artifacts from these settlements, challenging the simplistic narrative of marauding savages. Scholars debate whether these incursions represented collapse or transformation, but their impact on local economies, governance, and culture is undeniable. The Mediterranean, too, was a theatre of obscure conflicts. The Lombards in Italy fought Byzantines and papal forces intermittently for control of territory. Coastal raids, shifting alliances, and temporary conquests created a patchwork of power rarely documented in detail. One quirky note: in some records, soldiers are said to have used flaming pigs to scare enemy cavalry, a tactic that sounds fantastical but may reflect real ingenuity on the battlefield. Religious motives often intersected with military campaigns. Bishops sometimes accompanied armies, blessing troops or negotiating truces. Saints' relics were carried into battle, believed to confer divine favour. Yet, even with divine endorsement, the outcomes of wars were far from certain, and victories were often temporary. Cities changed hands, borders fluctuated, and entire populations were displaced. The deliberate rewriting of history further obscures these wars. Victors often chronicled events to magnify their achievements and diminish opponents. Battles that ended indecisively might be portrayed as resounding victories. Massacres of allies sometimes went unrecorded. Scholars still debate the accuracy of early chronicles, noting that bias, omission, and exaggeration create a fog over the martial past. Despite this, the Shrouded Wars shaped Europe. Borders drawn in these centuries influenced medieval kingdoms. Alliances and enmities formed patterns lasting for generations. The echoes of these conflicts can still be traced in law codes, place names, and even folklore. What appears as a chaotic and forgotten era was, in truth, a crucible in which the political and cultural contours of Europe were forged, the Islamic golden mirror. While Europe grappled with fragmented kingdoms and localized conflicts, a different world was flourishing across the Mediterranean and into the Middle East, the Islamic Golden Age. From the 8th to the 13th centuries, scholars, engineers, physicians, and philosophers in cities like Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo created a civilization whose achievements would profoundly influence Europe, though much of this impact remained hidden or mediated through intermediaries. Baghdad, founded in 762 CE as the Abbasid capital, became a hub of intellectual activity. The House of Wisdom, a grand library and translation centre, attracted scholars from Persia, India, Greece, and beyond. Greek classics, Aristotle, Galen, Ptolemy, were translated into Arabic, studied, and expanded upon. Astronomers charted the stars with precision, mathematicians developed algebra and refined the concept of zero, while physicians documented diseases and surgical techniques centuries ahead of their European counterparts. Scholars debate whether Europe's later Renaissance owed more to these translations or to rediscovery of local Latin texts, but the connections are undeniable. In Al-Andalus, modern Spain under Islamic rule, Cordoba rivaled Baghdad in splendour. Its libraries reportedly contained hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Engineers perfected irrigation systems, expanding agriculture in arid regions, while artisans produced intricate metalwork and textiles that were exported across the continent. The coexistence of Muslims, Christians, and Jews in this region fostered a multicultural environment in which ideas flowed freely, often blending traditions in unexpected ways. Meanwhile, trade linked Islamic centres with Europe. Mediterranean ports, Venetian merchants, and Muslim caravans created networks through which goods, ideas, and technologies travelled. Paper, introduced from China and refined by Islamic craftsmen, revolutionized European manuscript production. Medical texts, mathematical treatises, and philosophical works would eventually cross the Alps, planting seeds for the intellectual revival centuries later. Yet the influence was often filtered and misunderstood. Early European scholars sometimes regarded Islamic learning with suspicion, describing it as exotic or even heretical. Some claimed, in later centuries, that certain classical works miraculously survived through Arab hands, obscuring the deliberate preservation and enhancement undertaken by Muslim scholars. Fringe theories suggest that advanced engineering, navigation, or medical knowledge was suppressed in Europe due to cultural or religious prejudice. But the undeniable truth is that these lost sparks travelled west, even if indirectly. A curious anecdote comes from Toledo in the 12th century, where a Christian scholar reportedly employed Jewish and Muslim translators to render Arabic texts into Latin. One story tells of a translator secretly adding clarifications to correct earlier misunderstandings, preserving subtle insights that would otherwise have been lost. Such moments, hidden in footnotes of history, reflect the intricate transmission of knowledge across cultures. Scholars still debate how consciously Europe borrowed from the Islamic world versus independently rediscovering knowledge. Regardless, the Golden Age of Islam cast a mirror for Europe, a civilization thriving while Europe struggled politically and socially. Its libraries, observatories, and schools were proof that intellectual life could flourish even outside the former Roman sphere. This contrast also challenges the narrative of a monolithic Dark Age. While European cities shrank and trade networks faltered, elsewhere the world moved forward, preserving, creating, and transmitting ideas that would later help illuminate the West. The Islamic Golden Age reminds us that darkness is relative. While Europe struggled, knowledge and civilization continued to burn brightly across the globe. The Viking Enigma. By the late 8th century, Northern Europe witnessed the emergence of a force that would both terrify and transform the continent, the Vikings. Far from the one-dimensional marauders of popular imagination, these Scandinavian seafarers were traders, settlers, explorers, and warriors. Their raids, settlements, and cultural exchanges left an enduring mark on Europe, shaping political, economic, and social landscapes in ways that written chronicles only partially reveal. The first recorded raid at the monastery of Lindisfarne in 793 CE shocked contemporaries. Monks described heathen men arriving by longships, slaughtering defenceless clergy, and looting treasures. The shock was amplified by the violence and audacity, yet these raids were not merely acts of savagery. They were strategic incursions aimed at wealth and influence. Over time, raiders extended their reach to the coasts of Francia, the Iberian Peninsula, and even the Mediterranean. The Viking longship, with its shallow draft and speed, allowed unprecedented mobility and surprise, making these expeditions possible. However, Vikings were also skilled traders and settlers. Archaeology in York and Dublin reveals thriving communities, fortified harbours, and workshops producing metalwork and jewellery of high craftsmanship. Goods like silver dirhams from the Islamic world appear in Scandinavian hoards, demonstrating their extensive trade networks. Some Viking settlements became permanent, integrating with local populations and contributing to the fusion of cultures. Scholars still debate how seamlessly these Norse communities merged with native societies, and whether they were assimilated voluntarily or through coercion. The Viking impact was not purely economic or political. Myth and storytelling flourished, preserving their memory in sagas and oral traditions. These tales, often written centuries later, depict gods, heroes, and voyages that blurred the line between history and legend. One quirky example, a saga recounts a Viking navigating the seas using a sunstone, a crystal said, to reveal the sun's location even on cloudy days. While likely embellished, some modern experiments suggest that certain crystals can indeed polarize light, hinting at practical knowledge hidden within myth. Violence and settlement were intertwined with diplomacy. Vikings negotiated treaties, accepted tributes, and sometimes served as mercenaries for European rulers. In Francia, the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte in 911 allowed the Viking leader Rollo to settle in Normandy, establishing a lineage that would later produce William the Conqueror. Such agreements illustrate that the Viking presence was as much political as martial, creating new power structures that shaped the future of Europe. The enigmatic nature of Viking activity challenges traditional narratives of the Dark Ages. While European chroniclers emphasized fear and devastation, archaeological and linguistic evidence shows a nuanced picture, a world in which Norse culture, commerce, and knowledge interacted dynamically with local societies. Even now, scholars debate whether Vikings should be seen primarily as raiders, traders, or settlers, or whether they defy any single category entirely. The Viking Enigma reminds us that history is rarely straightforward. The terror they inspired, the settlements they built, and the myths they left behind are all part of a tapestry revealing a complex, interconnected Europe, one that was far from uniformly dark. Their longships, long buried in silt or memory, carried not just warriors but ideas, technologies, and stories that would ripple across the continent for centuries. The Carolingian dream. By the late 8th century, a new power emerged in Western Europe that promised to unify the fractured post-Roman world, the Carolingians. Charlemagne, crowned emperor in 800 CE by Pope Leo III, became the embodiment of this dream, a ruler who sought not only conquest but cultural and administrative revival. His empire, stretching from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, represented an ambitious attempt to recreate, or at least evoke, the grandeur of Rome in a distinctly medieval context. Charlemagne's achievements were as much symbolic as practical. He standardized weights, measures, and legal codes, sought to improve literacy, and encouraged the creation of a network of monasteries to preserve and transmit knowledge. Under the guidance of scholars like Alcuin of York, the Carolingian Renaissance fostered learning and art on a scale previously unseen in the West. Manuscripts were copied with new clarity, illuminated with vivid colours, and designed to last centuries. Scholars still debate whether this revival truly constituted a renaissance or merely a preservation effort of classical texts under the patronage of a powerful ruler. Military campaigns consolidated his power, but also revealed the fragility of centralized authority. Charlemagne waged wars against the Saxons for decades, sometimes forcing conversion to Christianity through violence, a practice both strategic and deeply controversial. In Spain, his efforts to expand the empire were only partially successful, illustrating the limits of even the most ambitious rulers. These campaigns created both loyalty and resentment, laying foundations for future regional conflicts long after his death in 814 CE. Charlemagne's court became a magnet for intellectuals, diplomats, and artisans from across Europe. He cultivated a vision of an empire guided by Christian principles but infused with Roman administrative efficiency. Coins minted in Aachen bore inscriptions proclaiming his authority, while legal decrees were distributed to far-flung provinces to unify governance. Yet, the Carolingian Empire relied heavily on local elites, and in many regions, the emperor's influence was more aspirational than practical. One quirky detail illustrates the blend of vision and ritual that characterized his reign. At Aachen, Charlemagne reportedly had a throne of judgment set beneath a halo-like window designed to cast sunlight onto him during ceremonies. The effect was both psychological and symbolic, asserting divine favour and reinforcing his role as both ruler and moral authority. While such stories may be embellished, they highlight the Carolingian fusion of politics, religion, and spectacle. Despite its grandeur, the Carolingian dream was fragile. After Charlemagne's death, the empire fragmented under the Treaty of Verdun in 843, dividing lands among his grandsons. This fragmentation illustrates a recurring pattern of the early medieval world. Centralized ambition often gave way to localized power, leaving the continent dotted with competing kingdoms and principalities. Yet, the intellectual and cultural investments of Charlemagne's reign persisted, influencing education, law, and governance for centuries. The Carolingian dream reminds us that the early Middle Ages were not merely a period of decline. Ambition, vision, and intellectual curiosity existed alongside violence, famine, and instability. Charlemagne's empire may have been temporary, but it offered a model of order, learning, and authority that would echo throughout Europe, inspiring rulers, scholars, and chroniclers alike. The rise of towns and trade. As kingdoms consolidated power and faith-structured society, another transformation quietly reshaped Europe, the resurgence of towns and trade. Long thought to be a stagnant era, the early Middle Ages witnessed the gradual revival of commerce, markets, and urban life. These developments laid the groundwork for the medieval economy that would flourish in the High Middle Ages. Initially, towns were often fortresses of survival. Many grew around castles, abbeys, or river crossings, providing security in a world marked by raids and warfare. Yet they also became centres of exchange. Archaeology in places like Bruges and Lübeck shows workshops producing textiles, metal tools, and ceramics by the 10th century. Coins, once rare, circulated increasingly, evidence of growing economic sophistication. Even Viking settlements like Dublin functioned as trading hubs, connecting the North Sea to the broader European and Islamic worlds. Scholars still debate whether these towns represented a true economic revival or were simply localized responses to necessity. Markets became essential social and economic spaces. Seasonal fairs attracted merchants from distant lands, facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and culture. One curious example, in the early 11th century, records suggest that merchants in southern France traded pepper, furs, and even slaves, alongside everyday items like grain and wool. This mixture of commodities reflects both the local needs and the global connections emerging in Europe. Trade networks extended beyond Europe's borders. Silver from the Islamic world, amber from the Baltic, and silk from Byzantium travelled vast distances. Even small villages participated indirectly in these networks, exchanging surplus goods for necessities and luxury items. Roads, rivers, and newly built bridges enabled commerce to flourish, while fairs and guilds began to formalise trade practices and standards. The rise of towns also transformed social structures. Craftsmen and merchants accumulated wealth independently of feudal hierarchies, challenging traditional power. Guilds, early forms of professional associations, regulated trades, protected workers, and sometimes wielded political influence. Women occasionally played crucial roles in these urban economies, running businesses, controlling property, or participating in markets. Scholars still debate the extent of female agency in these commercial spaces, but evidence points to more participation than previously assumed. Cultural and intellectual life followed trade. Towns became centres of literacy, legal administration, and even artistic production. Manuscripts and architectural styles circulated alongside goods, blending regional styles into a pan-European aesthetic. One quirky anecdote from 12th century Cologne tells of a merchant guild commissioning a clock that chimed to signal market hours, a blend of engineering, commerce, and civic pride that foreshadowed the urban innovations of later centuries. The resurgence of towns and trade demonstrates that Europe was not a stagnant or uniformly dark continent. Economic ingenuity, mobility, and connectivity were growing quietly, shaping daily life and social structures. These networks transformed survival strategies into flourishing commerce, slowly laying the foundations for wealth, power, and cultural exchange that would define the High Middle Ages and eventually challenge the old feudal order. The lesson is clear. Even in periods overshadowed by conflict, famine, or religious orthodoxy, human ingenuity found a way to reconnect, exchange, and innovate. The rise of towns reminds us that darkness is never total. Commerce, craft, and culture persist, flickering steadily beneath the surface, ready to illuminate the centuries to come. The shadow of the Vikings in the East. While the Vikings are often remembered for their impact on Western Europe, their influence stretched far into the East, shaping the emerging states of Russia and the Baltic in ways rarely acknowledged in traditional narratives. The so-called Varangians, Scandinavian adventurers and traders, travelled along rivers like the Dnieper and Volga, interacting with Slavic tribes, Byzantium, and the Islamic caliphates, leaving a lasting imprint on politics, trade, and culture. In the 9th century, the semi-legendary figure Rurik established a dynasty in Novgorod, laying the foundations for what would become Kievan Rus. Though details remain debated, some chronicles romanticize his arrival as almost mythical. Archaeology confirms Scandinavian artifacts such as jewellery, weapons, and coins in settlements along these rivers. These objects testify to integration between Norse leaders and local Slavic populations, blending governance, warfare, and cultural practices. Scholars still debate how much of this was conquest versus cooperative assimilation, but the result was the creation of new political structures in Eastern Europe. Trade played a central role. Rivers served as highways connecting the Baltic to the Black Sea, enabling movement of furs, honey, wax, and slaves. Byzantine coins found in Novgorod indicate extensive commerce, while Arabic dirhams discovered in hoards show even further reaching connections. These trading networks allowed cultural and technological exchange, from shipbuilding techniques to metallurgical skills. One quirky example: some Varangian graves contain gaming pieces that suggest early forms of chess, hinting at cross-cultural influences long before the game became popular in Western Europe. The Varangians also entered the military sphere. In Byzantium, they became the famed Varangian Guard, elite mercenaries who protected the emperor himself. Their presence illustrates the dual identity of Vikings as both raiders and valued allies, capable of integrating into sophisticated political structures far from their northern homelands. Scholars debate whether the European perception of Vikings as barbaric oversimplifies the complex realities of their eastern engagements. Religiously and culturally, these interactions shaped local developments. Christianity spread through Kievan Rus in the 10th century under Prince Vladimir, blending Byzantine ritual with local traditions. However, pagan beliefs persisted alongside Christian practices for centuries, echoing the pattern of syncretism seen elsewhere in Europe. Folklore, festivals, and burial practices retained Norse elements, evidence that conquest did not erase prior traditions but layered them, creating a hybridized cultural landscape. The shadow of the Vikings in the East challenges the Western-centric view of the Dark Ages. While Europe was struggling to consolidate kingdoms and towns, the northern adventurers were creating cross-continental networks, blending cultures, and establishing durable political entities. Their legacy reminds us that history is interconnected. What seems peripheral in one region can be central in another. Ultimately, the Varangians were more than marauders. They were agents of change, bridging north, east, and south, leaving traces in governance, trade, and culture that endured long after their initial arrivals. Their story, often overlooked, illustrates that even in a period commonly labelled as dark, dynamism, adaptation, and influence flowed across continents, quietly shaping the future of Europe and beyond. Monastic networks and knowledge transmission. By the 10th and 11th centuries, monasteries had become the arteries through which knowledge, culture, and administrative practices flowed across Europe. These religious institutions were far more than isolated spiritual retreats. They were centres of learning, scribal production, and even political negotiation. Their networks connected distant regions, preserving classical texts, theological debates, and practical knowledge during an era often mischaracterized as intellectually stagnant. Irish monasteries, particularly those in Iona and Clonmacnoise, exemplify this phenomenon. Despite Ireland's geographic isolation, monks travelled to the continent, carrying manuscripts, relics, and scholarly expertise. Their illuminated texts, like the Book of Kells, demonstrate not only aesthetic brilliance but also a sophisticated understanding of mathematics, geometry, and symbolism. Marginalia and annotations reveal that monks were not mere copyists, but active interpreters, engaging with the material, correcting errors, and sometimes adding local insights. Scholars debate whether this constitutes genuine innovation or careful preservation, but the intellectual vitality is undeniable. On the continent, Benedictine monasteries such as Monte Cassino and Cluny became hubs of learning and influence. Monte Cassino preserved works of Roman historians, legal texts, and medical treatises. Cluny, by the 10th century, wielded immense power, reforming ecclesiastical practices, establishing a network of dependent priories, and shaping liturgical standards across Europe. The scriptoriums of these monasteries ensured that knowledge was not merely hoarded, but actively transmitted, reaching courts, schools, and other religious centres. Trade and travel further amplified this effect. Pilgrimages, diplomatic missions, and monastic emissaries facilitated too. Exchange of ideas. One curious case comes from the Abbey of St. Gall, where scribes maintained weather and agricultural observations alongside theological writings. These records hint at empirical observation integrated into spiritual life, suggesting that monasteries played a role in practical knowledge as well as religious devotion. Scholars still debate how systematically such knowledge influenced broader medieval society, but the evidence suggests more continuity than interruption. The role of women in these networks should not be overlooked. Female monasteries, such as those led by abbesses at Schell or Gandersheim, contributed significantly to manuscript production, education, and social administration. Their influence ensured that intellectual life was not solely male-dominated, and that the preservation of texts was a collaborative endeavour. Even the architecture of monasteries facilitated learning. Libraries, cloisters, and chapels were designed not only for worship, but for study, reflection, and the copying of texts. This spatial arrangement reinforced the idea that spiritual and intellectual work were inseparable. The careful transmission of manuscripts and knowledge created a cultural continuity that bridged the gap between late antiquity and the later Middle Ages, yet scholars still debate whether these networks were as effective in reaching lay populations. While monasteries preserved and transmitted knowledge, literacy outside these walls remained limited. The full impact of monastic learning may have been subtle, shaping elites and clerics more than the broader populace. Still, the networks laid the foundations for the intellectual revival of the 12th century, demonstrating that knowledge, even in so-called dark times, can endure and spread in unexpected ways. Monastic networks remind us that the Dark Ages were not uniformly dark. Knowledge survived through the careful labour of monks and nuns, through the circulation of texts, ideas, and innovations, and through the deliberate effort to preserve human achievement against the fragility of time. These institutions were silent engines of cultural continuity, ensuring that the wisdom of the past could illuminate the future, art, symbolism, and the mind's eye. Amid the turmoil, plagues, and political shifts of the early Middle Ages, art emerged as a quiet yet powerful medium of expression and continuity. From illuminated manuscripts to intricately carved crosses, art was a lens through which people communicated religious devotion, social status, and cultural identity. In many ways, these creations reflect not only aesthetics, but the very structure of medieval thought, a symbolic world where the visible and invisible intertwined. Illuminated manuscripts, like the Book of Kells in Ireland or the Lindisfarne Gospels in England, combined text and image in ways that transcended simple storytelling. Vivid colours, interlacing patterns, and stylized figures conveyed theological concepts, historical memory, and narrative in a single page. These works were labour-intensive, often produced over years by monks whose devotion and precision transformed parchment into sacred objects. Some scholars argue that the highly abstracted forms, such as swirling knotwork or zoomorphic motifs, reflect not merely artistic choice, but a spiritual meditation, art as prayer. Others debate whether these designs incorporated remnants of pagan visual culture, subtly layered beneath Christian symbolism. Carved stone and metalwork offered another form of expression. High crosses in Ireland and Scotland, often standing in public spaces, communicated religious stories, law codes, and social values to largely illiterate populations. In Scandinavia, runestones preserved names, deeds, and even mythic references, merging ancestral memory with the landscape itself. One quirky example: some runestones feature enigmatic carvings of creatures that seem part bird, part serpent, prompting scholars to speculate whether these were purely decorative, protective symbols or mnemonic devices for oral storytelling. Architecture, too, carried symbolic weight. Churches were designed to guide not only the body but the mind. The soaring vaults of Carolingian or Ottonian structures directed the gaze upward, invoking the divine. Capitals, frescoes, and mosaics reinforced moral lessons, historical memory, and communal identity. In many ways, these buildings functioned as both spiritual and educational tools, embedding knowledge in stone and glass. Scholars still debate the degree to which these artistic choices were standardized versus locally adapted, revealing a tension between centralized authority and regional creativity. Even everyday objects bore artistic significance. Metal brooches, ceramics, and textiles incorporated symbolic motifs, sometimes reflecting status, spiritual beliefs, or storytelling traditions. In some graves, intricate jewellery appears alongside practical tools, suggesting a blend of utility and expression. These artefacts remind us that aesthetic sensibility was not confined to elites or clergy. Artistry permeated daily life, weaving a visual culture that communicated values across generations. The persistence of abstract and symbolic art challenges the notion that the Dark Ages were culturally barren. Across Europe, visual language flourished, preserving memory, belief, and innovation in forms that survived far longer than many written texts. Art became a vessel for collective consciousness, bridging temporal and geographical gaps, conveying continuity even amid chaos. In essence, early medieval art reflects the mind's eye, a culture simultaneously grounded in the material world and attuned to unseen realms, translating faith, identity, and memory into forms that endure. These works, manuscripts, crosses, carvings, and artifacts, offer a window into a civilization often misrepresented as lost or primitive, revealing creativity, devotion, and resilience thriving in the shadows of history. Memory and myth, rewriting the Dark Ages. As the millennium turned, Europe began to look back on its own past, interpreting centuries of upheaval, conquest, and survival through the lens of memory, myth, and selective storytelling. What we now call the Dark Ages was largely a construct, a combination of real crises, historiographical bias, and later ideological agendas. Understanding this process of rewriting history is essential to grasping how narratives shape perception and, ultimately, how societies remember themselves. Medieval chroniclers often had motives beyond recording facts. Monks, nobles, and clerics wrote histories that justified their own authority, exalted patrons, or explained political boundaries. For example, the Annals of Fulda, documenting Carolingian politics, highlight victories and omit failures, creating a version of events convenient for the ruling elite. Similarly, chronicles of Viking raids emphasized horror and devastation, often underrepresenting settlement, trade, and cultural integration. These selective narratives reinforced the notion of a Europe in decline, setting the stage for later historians to coin the term Dark Ages. Scholars still debate how much of these portrayals reflect reality versus ideological framing. Memory itself was filtered through oral tradition. Epic poems, sagas, and folklore preserved stories of heroes, saints, and monsters, blending fact with myth. The figure of King Arthur in Britain, Charlemagne in France, or Rurik in Russia illustrates how societies shaped collective memory to reflect ideals, fears, and aspirations. Often, historical kernels were preserved within fantastical narratives. Battles, alliances, and migrations were encoded within legend, awaiting later interpretation by scholars. One quirky example comes from Iceland, where a saga recounts a Viking navigating the sea using a sunstone, an account blending observation, myth, and imaginative storytelling. The rewriting of history also served moral and didactic purposes. Chroniclers emphasized divine providence, framing success or failure as a reflection of God's favor or wrath. Plagues, famines, and wars were interpreted as punishment or testing, embedding lessons for future generations. Such moralized narratives reinforced authority, justified policies, and shaped cultural memory, even when historical accuracy was secondary. By the High Middle Ages, intellectual revival began to reframe the past. Scholars revisited classical texts, interrogated monastic archives, and compared chronicles, gradually uncovering discrepancies and alternative accounts. Renaissance humanists later emphasized the survival of knowledge through monastic, Islamic, and Byzantine channels, highlighting continuity rather than collapse. Yet even today, the phrase Dark Ages lingers, reflecting the enduring power of selective narrative. This process of memory and myth underscores a crucial truth. History is not merely a record of events, but a story told by successive generations, each with its own priorities, biases, and imagination. The centuries often labelled dark were, in reality, a complex interplay of survival, creativity, cultural exchange, and reinterpretation. The world of monasteries, women leaders, pagan persistence, Viking networks, and early towns was vibrant, even if filtered through a later lens of obscurity. Ultimately, the Dark Ages were neither uniformly dark nor uniformly lost. They were a period of transformation, adaptation, and hidden brilliance, remembered selectively and mythologized for centuries. By examining the ways history itself is constructed, we gain insight not only into the era, but into the processes that shape collective memory, illuminating truths that lie beneath legend and misconception. Conclusion: beyond the shadows, the Dark Ages, long mischaracterized as an era of stagnation and decline, reveal themselves as a period of resilience, ingenuity, and interconnectedness. Across Europe, societies faced plagues, famine, and political fragmentation, yet humans innovated, preserved knowledge, and adapted to survive. Women wielded hidden influence, Monasteries safeguarded learning, and trade networks and urban centres quietly flourished. Viking, Carolingian, and Islamic influences shaped politics, culture, and technology in ways that would resonate for centuries. Art, architecture, and literature provided both spiritual guidance and cultural memory, bridging generations and preserving continuity. Above all, the darkness is a construct, a lens through which later historians viewed a complex, dynamic world. By studying archaeology, manuscripts, folklore, and architecture, we uncover a Europe that was inventive, connected, and far from stagnant. The Dark Ages were not an absence of light, but a different form of illumination, subtle, hidden, and resilient. In understanding this era, we grasp how societies endure, adapt, and transmit culture, even in the shadows, offering lessons about human ingenuity and perseverance that resonate to this day